Imagine living 4,000 years ago. No smartphones, no locked bedrooms, no apartment doors, no curtains from a modern store. And yet, you still needed a place where nobody could see you, a place to sleep, a place to change clothes, a place to talk privately, and sometimes a place where you could simply be alone. So here's the strange question: how did ancient Egyptians have privacy? Because when we imagine ancient Egypt, we usually picture enormous temples, crowded markets, busy workers, and huge royal palaces. But behind those monuments, ordinary Egyptians were living surprisingly private lives. And the answer begins with something much simpler than the pyramids: their homes. Imagine walking through an ancient Egyptian neighborhood. Most ordinary houses were built from mud brick. From the outside, the house might look fairly simple. But once you entered, the layout could create different levels of privacy. Instead of having one giant open room where everyone did everything, homes could contain separate spaces for different activities. There could be areas for cooking, areas for storage, spaces for sleeping, and in larger homes, there could be courtyards and more private rooms deeper inside the house. This meant that privacy didn't necessarily require modern walls and locks. Sometimes, the layout itself created privacy. Think about it. If someone wanted to speak privately with a family member, they didn't need a modern soundproof room. They could simply move farther inside the house, and this becomes even more interesting when we look at wealthier Egyptians. Elite houses could be much larger. Some had multiple rooms arranged around courtyards. There could be reception areas for visitors, while more private parts of the house were further away. So, if an important guest arrived, you didn't necessarily have strangers walking through every part of your home. The house could separate public life from private life. And this idea is actually very familiar to us today. Your living room is different from your bedroom. Your front door is different from the private areas of your house. Ancient Egyptians didn't have modern architecture, but they understood the same basic principle. Where you are in a building can determine who can see you. But what about sleeping? This is where ancient Egyptian homes become fascinating. Not everyone had a huge private bedroom. For many ordinary families, space was limited. Different members of a household could share living spaces. So privacy was probably not always perfect. In fact, we shouldn't imagine ancient Egypt as some perfectly private modern world. Families lived close together, homes could be crowded, and everyday life meant people were constantly interacting. But privacy didn't have to mean being completely alone. Sometimes it simply meant having a moment away from everyone else. And one place that could provide this was the roof. Ancient Egyptian houses often had flat roofs, and roofs could be useful spaces. People could spend time there, work there, or sleep there during hot weather. Imagine the sun finally disappearing over the Nile. The temperature begins to fall. The streets become quieter, and a family goes up onto the roof, away from the activity inside the house. For some people, the roof could become a surprisingly peaceful private space. But there was another problem: bathrooms. Modern privacy feels incomplete without one. So, what did ancient Egyptians do? They had toilets. Archaeologists have discovered toilet seats and toilet arrangements in ancient Egyptian homes. Some were simple, some were more elaborate, but they show something important. Ancient Egyptians understood that certain activities required separation from ordinary household life. Privacy wasn't always luxurious, sometimes it was simply practical. And there was another side to privacy that we often forget: personal belongings. Imagine owning something valuable thousands of years ago: jewelry, clothing, food, tools, or important documents. You couldn't just put everything into a modern safe. Instead, households could use storage spaces, containers, chests, and other places to keep possessions. The more organized the household, the easier it became to control who had access to different things. So privacy wasn't only about people, it was also about access. Who can enter? Who can see? Who can touch? Who can take something? And this brings us to one of the most interesting parts of ancient Egyptian society: social status. Privacy wasn't equally available to everyone. A wealthy official could live in a large house with multiple rooms and courtyards. A poor laborer might live in a much smaller space. So the amount of physical privacy you had could depend heavily on how much space your family could afford. In other words, privacy could be a privilege. And the royal household was different again. Pharaohs lived in enormous palace complexes. They had servants, guards, officials, priests, and administrators around them. That sounds like the opposite of privacy. And sometimes it probably was. Imagine being the Pharaoh. You are surrounded by people almost constantly. Servants bring food, officials bring reports, guards protect you, priests perform rituals, people want your attention. So even the most powerful person in Egypt could have a strange problem. The more important you became, the more people had access to you. That's why private royal spaces mattered. Palaces could have restricted areas where only certain people were allowed. The ruler could move away from public ceremonial spaces into areas reserved for the royal household. So even the pharaoh needed boundaries. And here's the biggest lesson: ancient Egyptians didn't have privacy in exactly the same way we think about it today. They didn't have modern locks, smartphones, surveillance cameras, or soundproof bedrooms. But they understood something fundamental. People need spaces where they can separate themselves from others. Their houses created different levels of access. Courtyards created separation. Private rooms created distance. Roofs offered another space away from crowded interiors. Toilets provided practical privacy. And wealth determined how much personal space someone could afford. So, how did ancient Egyptians have privacy? They built it into everyday life. Not perfectly, not equally, and definitely not in the modern sense. But through architecture, household organization, social boundaries, and simple physical separation, they created private moments thousands of years before modern civilization. And perhaps that's the strangest part. When you walk through the ruins of an ancient Egyptian house, you're not just looking at mud brick walls, you're looking at one of humanity's oldest attempts to answer a very modern problem. How do you live together without being around each other every second?